Welcome to Living Hope. With today's teaching, here's the Reverend Richard Brunton.
Hello, welcome to the Living Hope program today. I'm persisting with this topic of trying to pick up a few people that, although they're known in Scripture, they're certainly not massively known in the way that key characters like Paul, the 12 disciples, although some of them we don't know too much about. But it's really just acknowledging that God has taken and he does choose people for his purposes, even if the overall sort of awareness of them isn't that great. And today I want to think about the little girl who lived in the house of Naaman. We don't know a great deal about her, but I think what we know is very, very significant. Now, what happened was that when a band of raiders had gone out, they took captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. And it really is the providence of God. You can imagine, and today we hear of young girls who have been picked up by different forces, and we know that sometimes their fate is extraordinarily bad. They're forced into marriages that they wouldn't really want, forced to have children when they're hardly ready for that, not really out of childhood totally themselves. There's some very tragic stories, but sometimes we do come across a story where God has been in the midst of a situation to bring about good. This little girl, we don't know, as I've said, even her name, but nevertheless, what we do discover is that I believe she was a godly young girl. And even though she was away from Israel, she continued, I believe, to worship and pray to the God of Israel. She was in a advantaged position compared to some, whereby she was in the house of Naaman, who was the great commander. And we know that Naaman was a very, very powerful commander. He'd won many, many victories. He was respected very much by his king, and I'm sure loved by his wife. And what happens is that Naaman perhaps decides that this little girl should be kept away from others and that she should come into his own household. Now, we don't know, but what we read is that she's there serving Naaman's wife, probably in some very mundane tasks. But she would have been well fed, she would have been clothed, and she would have been relatively safe compared to other young girls. And she just gets on with the task of doing the different duties that are assigned to her. Now, what we also see about this young girl is that she's attentive to what's going on in the household. She's not nosy, she's not rude, but she cannot help but pick up maybe some discussion, conversation about her master, the husband, Naaman, that he was very, very ill. And, well, you get the impression that she is concerned about that. I mean, some people would just be very bitter and very resentful. They've been taken out of their home, out of their security, out of their comfort zone in many, many ways. But again, we get the impression that this godly little girl has a heart for the family that she's been placed in, and she is concerned. She sees how worried Naaman's wife is. We're not told about anyone else in the house, but she's picked up all these concerns. And one day she says to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who's in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." And she must have been very bold to say anything, because remember that she's a slave. She's got no rights within the family situation, and she certainly has no right to talk about whatever discussions are going on between Naaman and his wife. But she is alert, she is aware, and she has compassion and she has concern. And she may have lost so many things. She may have lost many possessions. She may well have lost her parents. Who knows whether they had been killed in these raids that were taking place? We don't know. But what we do know is she had not lost her faith and trust in God. And that's just such an incredible example, because there are so many things that can go wrong for people in life. And sadly, understandably, but sadly, sometimes what happens is that people say, if God's allowed that to happen to me, I'm never going to believe in him again. I'm never going to trust him again. And that's regrettable, because you're turning away from the very one who's able to help. But it does happen. And it does mean that instead of being in a place of receiving help, one has pushed oneself further away from God, but not from his love. Well, the little girl has her faith, has her trust in God, and she plucks up the courage to speak to Naaman's wife and says, "Look, if my master could see the prophet in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Now, that's an incredibly bold statement. There are many people of many mature years who might think twice about making such a bold statement, but her faith is in a very good place. It's a very high level. She says, if my master could get to see the prophet, I believe that he walks with God and that he could pronounce healing for the master, for Naaman. Now, she must have said that with some conviction. It wasn't flippant. It wasn't just sort of a passing remark. It had to be said with such conviction that Naaman's wife wants to talk to her husband and says, "Look, you know the young girl in our house. This is what she's saying." Now, again, it could be that Naaman had spent money on doctors and he'd taken various medicines and nothing changed. And if anything, the leprosy was getting worse. I don't know exactly how severe it was. He did, in the end, make this long journey to Israel and to the prophet's house. But it's very important to notice that he is so desperate and so believing in this little girl that he will make the journey and he will head out to Israel. Well, it's quite incredible that he does that, but he does do that, and he decides that he will respond to this little girl's faith. Now, I think it's important just to continue to look at the fact that Naaman is listening to the little girl, and please excuse me, I'm just going to turn my my phone off because I don't want to be interrupted. But what we see is that he is going to find help, but his mind has been tuned into a sort of, if you like, a political approach, as opposed to listening absolutely precisely to what the little girl has said. Naaman thinks protocol will mean that he'll have to go to the king of Israel. Now, the king of Israel is not the answer. And it's good. It's good the little girl doesn't say, my master should see the king. The little girl knows that the master must see the prophet. He's the one who's going to be able to help. But Naaman picks it up along the lines of the political protocol is I go and see the king. Well, the king, when he gets there, and we don't actually have a record of how long the journey was, but I suspect it was quite a long time. And the king is really frightened because he thinks that Naaman's king and ruler is picking a quarrel, and he's looking for an excuse to inflict punishment and damage on Israel when the king will say, there's nothing I can do. And it is very, very sad that there were many kings of Israel who were unable to help the people that were sent to them, and even people in their own nation. They should have known better, but they had lost their walk with God. They had forgotten the laws and the commands of the Lord God, and really they were very secular and very lost in their own ways. And the king of Israel, he doesn't know what to do. But then Naaman perhaps remembers, we're not given the full details, but thinks, well, what about the prophet? Send me to the prophet. Now, the prophet at the time, we read about him, the prophet is Elisha. Now, we know that there was Elijah, but we also know that Elisha succeeds Elijah. And he goes to the house. And again, remember, this is on the back of the little girl's testimony and the little girl's faith that if he makes this journey and if he goes to the prophet, he will receive healing. But now he finds himself knocking at the door of the prophet, and the prophet doesn't come to the door to answer him. Now again, for someone like Naaman, this would have seemed very bad politics, very poor diplomatic response. You know, he's a powerful man. He is somebody highly respected in his nation. And for the prophet not to come to the door, this was a real test to Naaman in terms of, I trusted that little girl. I've come with gifts and all of that. But okay, I made a mistake. I should have come here first of all and not go to the king. But he is really, really puzzled. And then there's a message that comes to Naaman from the prophet, and the prophet says, Naaman, if you go and dip yourself in the Jordan 7 times, you will be healed. Now, I'm sure the little girl didn't know exactly how this was going to go, but this again is a response that Naaman will find very difficult. I don't know how much he knew Israel, how well he knew Israel, but he's quite affronted and he has this sort of reasoning. There are rivers back home in Damascus that are eminently more suitable to bathe in than this Jordan River. It's filthy. However should I respond to this? And he's all for going home. And this is where his servants come alongside and they beg him and they say, please, please, because they loved him too. And I find it interesting, as I love history, and one of the things I've noticed more than once is that there can be very strong, very successful leaders of armies, but who command a very deep respect for their troops. And there's very much an attitude of just loving their leader and just being thoroughly absorbed in wanting to do the best for him. And some of these people who've travelled with him from Damascus to Israel, they say, please, Naaman, you are very sick. You are, well, I don't know if they had the courage to say, you haven't got long to live, but we very much get the impression that that's how it was. And they say, please, look, if only you would just do what the prophet says. We're not disagreeing with you that the rivers back home are better than here, but we want you healed. And if there's a chance in this peculiar request of you getting healed, we love you enough that we want you to get healed. And so we have the story continue, which I'm sure you know, and which I've preached on many, many times, that Naaman goes down into the water. He does dip himself under the water 7 times. Yeah, the Bible tells us that Naaman is healed, that the leprosy goes. But the miracle, which is always worth spending a little time on, the miracle is that his skin was not only cleansed from leprosy, but it becomes like a young boy. And Naaman has truly been persuaded by this. The prophet says, I don't want any money. I don't want any financial reward. And Naaman says, well, you know, when I go back, I want to worship your God. I'm going to have to be discreet about it, because if I'm kneeling in the temple with the king beside me, he's expecting me to worship his God. But in my heart, I won't be doing that anymore. I'll be lifting up your God. But if I'm too open about it, that could be very difficult. But the point is that not only is his body cleansed, but his heart is changed. And that's the testimony of the little girl, you see. Her circumstances changed radically when she was carted off into Samaria. But what hadn't changed, and we said this at the beginning, was her faith and trust in God. Naaman begins the story with his leprosy and with his death sentence, but he ends the day not just as someone who's been physically healed, but he ends the day as someone who now wants to serve the God of the little girl. Well, we know, just to be faithful to the story, we know the servant is overcome by the thought of wealth and riches, and he chases after Naaman and says, look, my master's changed his mind. That was a lie. My master's changed his mind, and it would be good to receive a present. And Gehazi, the servant, well, Naaman blesses him abundantly. But, you know, it's quite a tragic thing that when the prophet discovers what the servant Gehazi has done, he pronounces that the leprosy that was on Naaman and which has now been healed, that leprosy will come upon Gehazi. You don't mess about with God, and you don't become trivial and thoughtless with that which is precious to God. I want to just take you on, and I confess there's a fair bit of imagination in this. It's not actually directly in the scriptures, but I think that what I'm about to suggest is probably what happened. Can you imagine Naaman going back into the house? You could imagine his eyes are looking into the eyes of his wife. And can you just picture her just incredible joy? And she is just so thrilled, not simply to have Naaman back, and of course I'm sure she was pleased to see him, but she is so blessed to see that he is well and that there is no trace of the leprosy on his body. And other people will hear the story. I don't know how much Naaman broadcast it, because after all, to go to a foreign country and to go to a prophet of that foreign country, there would be some people who would not be terribly supportive or understanding of that idea. However, Naaman has done what he thought was right, and God has healed him. What I would really like to ponder is, I wonder what happens to the little girl. Remember that Naaman is a commander. He's a powerful man in his country. He's got a lot of respect and a lot of power. But I would just love to have seen the face of the little girl when she sees her master return home. And I am sure that although she's a slave girl, I'm sure that Naaman told her the story. I'm sure that Naaman shared with her just that wonderful, wonderful moment when he washes in the River Jordan and comes out of the River Jordan and he is healed. I'm sure she became aware. She saw that he was well, but you can just imagine him, as it were, confiding in her and probably thanking her and blessing her for her faithfulness to her God. The reason, I'm not just being sentimental, but the reason I'm sharing that is because there are many people like the little girl, people whose names are not known, people whose stories have not been revealed or broadcast, even to the extent that her story has been revealed and broadcast. But there are plenty of people who just serve faithfully, who have had a hard time. Maybe they were the equivalent of slaves. Maybe they've found a job in a good situation despite tremendous pressures of the past and bad experiences. But when they've got into these new situations, they have not forgotten their God. The little girl was always faithful to her God. And as she seeks to be faithful, that faithfulness is rewarded because this commander is now healed. And from what we can see, he has turned to serve the living God. Also remember that this little girl was just faithful in her commitment to her God. There's no way, when you think of her circumstances as a slave girl, that she was given the opportunity for a great sort of preach and message. It was just childlike faith, just taking an opportunity to speak for God in those circumstances. And as you're watching this program today, there may well be people watching. You're watching and you're in a situation where God is saying, speak up for me. Just gently, as it were, declare who I am. Talk about what I am able to do. Testify to my power and to my goodness. Testify to my ability to forgive. Testify to my ability to heal. Testify to my ability to deliver. And you just don't know, as you share your simple story of how God is able to take that and transform a life. That commander we said was well respected. I think he was respected even more, having come to a faith in the living God. Many lives would have been touched by the simple, humble testimony of the little girl. And as you talk about the Jesus who died on the cross for you and rose from the dead for you, your simple story can affect many people. Make sure you share it. God bless you.